Hi there guys, got a video here today on airgun tuning, and in this one we're going to be taking a look at plastic tipped hammers. These are sometimes called soft touch hammers or Delrin / peak tipped hammers, but I'll go over how they work, how I make my ones, and the pros and cons of doing the modification. Now the rifle I'm working on today is the AGT Vixen, however this modification will work on pretty much any airgun with a standard style hammer. Now, before we get started, the last thing I want to mention is that this is not my idea or invention. It's a very common modification done by airgun tuners. Right then, so what is a plastic tipped hammer and why is it used? Simply put, a plastic tipped hammer is a standard hammer with a plastic insert put into the tip. They're used to reduce the overall action noise of the rifle, and in sub 12-pound rifles, the plastic used is typically Delrin, which is a brand of acetyl pom H. Although Peak is also very common as well. Peak is more commonly used in high power rifles as it's much harder and less likely to deform after hitting the valve. Being harder, it is also less effective at reducing action noise, but both are commonly used. With that said, there are a number of other engineering plastics that can be used for the job, but whatever the material used, the main aim is to remove the metal-to-metal contact between the hammer and the valve. With that all out the way, let's take our current hammer, get it put into the lathe, and we'll get started on the modification. Right then, over at the lathe, the first thing to do is make the plastic tip. This one is going to be made from Delrin, and what I'm doing here is facing the end of the material, then turning the OD down to 4.2 millimeters. The size of the pip is determined by the valve pin diameter, and I like to make my plastic pips 1 to 2 millimeters larger than the valve, just to make sure they're fully covered. I also oversized the Delrin slightly to make it a press fit within the end of the hammer. Once that's all done, the next step is to put a small taper on the end of the pip just to help with installation, then it can be cut off a little over length. Turning our attention over to the hammer, all we need to do here is drill the end out to accept the plastic pip. I'm doing this with a solid carbide drill as the hammer is hardened, so a standard HSS drill bit typically won't cut it for this job. I'm drilling about 5 millimeters deep, and that should give us a good anchor depth for the plastic. Going too shallow can allow the plastic to work its way loose over time and become dislodged. But after the hole's drilled, I can just come through with the same size end mill and flatten out the bottom of the hole, and that just ensures that the plastic is making full contact with the hammer. Last thing to do is press the Delrin into the end of the hammer and face off the excess material. The only critical thing I'll mention at this stage is that the plastic must be fully supported by the hammer on all sides. If the plastic material is proud of the hammer face, it will deform and extrude over time as it has an area to expand into. In other words, if the plastic pip is left sticking out a little from the hammer face, it will mushroom out over time, so just be aware of that. Right then, has the Delrin tipped hammer made any difference to the action noise of the rifle? I'll put the before and after on screen now, and you can have a listen for yourself. I'm not sure how well the difference will translate on camera, but in real life the difference is quite noticeable. The action noise is certainly duller, more like a soft thud than a metal-to-metal clack, especially when your head is against the bottle. It doesn't remove the action noise entirely, but it does significantly reduce it. The main thing I notice is that when my head is against the bottle, you don't get the resonant vibration travelling through the block and into your ear through the bottle itself. So, is it a modification worth doing? On a sub 12-pound rifle, I would say certainly yes. It does help with the action noise, and even a Delrin tip, as long as it's fully supported and sufficiently deep, should last a lifetime. On a high power rifle, I would lean towards the peak tip and definitely check the hammer after 50 or so shots just to make sure the valve was not destroying it, but it's still certainly a modification I would look into. The only minor downsides is that drilling out the end of the hammer will slightly reduce hammer mass, so you may need a little more hammer spring tension to achieve the same power, and over time the end of the hammer may deform under repeated strikes. That's not typically a problem on sub-12 rifles, but on high power rifles it's something to keep an eye on. With that all said and done, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So, I hope the video has been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.